The blaze of the Texas sun shimmered off the parched earth as the scent of smoke and searing meat drifted across the wide-open ranch. A group of German captives, still in their faded Wehrmacht uniforms, stood hesitantly beside a long wooden table. They were soldiers who had once marched through France, fought across Africa, and served beneath the Black Cross of the Reich. Now they were guests, or at least it felt that way. At the center of the group sat Captain Erwin Schulte, a seasoned officer from Hamburg. His boots still shined out of habit. Before him rested a simple meal, a hamburger wrapped in paper, its juices bleeding through the white parchment, and a bottle of Coca-Cola so chilled that beads of condensation traced down its sides. A ranch hand with sun-creased skin and a broad-brimmed hat grinned and said, "Go on, Captain." "It's just beef and bread." Schulte paused. His eyes swept the scene, waiting for mockery or some hidden malice. None came. The ranchers laughed and chatted in English he barely comprehended. The guards stood nearby, relaxed, rifles slung low. It felt wrong. It felt unreal. He reached for the burger, his hand trembling faintly. The aroma struck him first, warm, savory, strange. He took a bite. The fat and salt filled his mouth, the taste unlike anything he had known in years. His jaw locked, the bite caught in his throat. He set the food down and lowered his head. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then he began to weep. It wasn't the taste of the meat or the sweetness of the soda he sipped next that broke him. It was the realization that everything he had been taught about America, its supposed cruelty, its depravity, its decadence, was a falsehood. The tears came slowly at first, then freely. The ranch fell silent, except for the whisper of the wind through the flags and the lowing of distant cattle. A guard named Miller stepped forward quietly, unsure what to do. "You all right, sir?" he asked gently. Schulte nodded, unable to form words. He gestured toward the meal, then toward the men around him, his voice shaking. "In Germany," he murmured, "we had nothing. You give prisoners this." The cowboy scratched at his neck, embarrassed. "Ain't right to let a man go hungry. War's hard enough." That simple truth hung in the air, plain and devastating. For the first time, Schulte saw his captors not as victors, but as men. Humans who refused to become the monsters their enemies had claimed them to be. He looked at the bottle of Coca-Cola, sunlight glinting through the glass. The bubbles danced like laughter. He raised it slightly, as though to toast something greater than triumph. That day, on a Texas ranch, a burger and a soda accomplished what no bullet or bomb ever could. They shattered the spirit of hatred that years of war had built. Later, in his journal, Schulte would write a single line that captured the moment forever. "They defeated us not with weapons, but with grace." By 1943, the war that had ravaged Europe began to stretch even into the quiet farmlands of Texas. Across the state, barbed wire fences rose where cattle once grazed. Guard towers replaced windmills, and army trucks rumbled down dusty roads, bearing an unlikely cargo: thousands of German prisoners of war. In all, more than 425,000 Axis soldiers would be held in the United States during World War II. Of those, over 50,000 Germans were sent to Texas. Scattered across vast camps and small towns with names like Hearne, Mexia, and Huntsville, the American South, with its wide spaces, sunlight, and distance from the front, became the unlikely refuge for men who had once fought beneath Hitler's banner. Captain Erwin Schulte had been captured in Tunisia during the North African campaign. He had expected brutality. German officers were told that American captives were beaten, starved, and shamed. They were warned that the Allies were savages who honored no laws of war. When Schulte's transport train arrived at Camp Hearne, he steeled himself for cruelty. Instead, he found discipline. The guards who lined the platform were polite but firm. The camp was orderly, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by tall fences. Inside, the Germans were given beds with mattresses, soap, even books from a library filled with German literature. A small canteen sold cigarettes and coffee. To men who had survived the front, it felt surreal. At first, Schulte and the others suspected deceit. Perhaps the comfort was meant to loosen their tongues or erode their morale. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear this was no trick. It was policy. The Geneva Convention, the guards explained, required humane treatment of prisoners. The Americans not only obeyed it, they surpassed it. Each man received nearly the same rations as U.S. soldiers. Letters home were censored but permitted. Red Cross parcels arrived regularly. Even religious services were held every Sunday, led by a captured German chaplain. And then there were the guards themselves. Mostly young men from rural towns, Texans, Kansans, Oklahomans, who treated their captives with a mix of respect and curiosity. They called the Germans fellows or boys, not enemies. One Texan, Private Dalton, once told Schulte as they walked the fence line, "You fought for your country. We did too. Guess we both just did what we were told." For a man raised under rigid authoritarianism, that casual honesty was staggering. In Germany, obedience meant survival. Here, freedom seemed to. Soon, Schulte noticed something else. When the guards looked at him, they didn't see a beaten foe. They saw a worker, a man, someone who could lend a hand fixing a fence or hauling hay. He began to wonder what kind of nation treated its prisoners better than its enemies treated their allies. Each night, lying in his bunk, he thought about the strangeness of it all. The clean sheets, the laughter outside the barracks, the drifting scent of barbecue smoke from nearby ranches. War was supposed to mean hatred and hunger. But here, behind American wire, there was order. There was decency, and, for Captain Schulte, that was more bewildering than any defeat on the battlefield. By the spring of 1944, the United States faced a different kind of struggle. With millions of young men serving overseas, the nation's farms, ranches, and factories were starved for labor. Crops went unharvested. Fences sagged. Cattle roamed freely under the blazing Texas sun. The war demanded food, leather, and meat. But there weren't enough hands to provide them. That was when the government turned to an unexpected workforce: the German prisoners. Under the civilian labor program, POWs could volunteer to work beyond the camp fences on farms and ranches across Texas. The Americans viewed it as both practical and moral. Give men honest work, pay them fairly, and keep them occupied. To the Germans, it sounded like humiliation. When Captain Erwin Schulte first heard that he and his men would be sent to labor on a local ranch, he bristled. "They will treat us like animals," he told his comrades. "We will pull plows with ropes around our necks." The next morning, a truck arrived. Not a prison transport, but an old army pickup driven by a cheerful cowboy in a wide-brimmed hat. "You boys ever seen a longhorn?" he called out. The men exchanged uncertain glances. When they reached the ranch, the world seemed to open wide. The air smelled of grass and smoke. Horses kicked up dust. The cowboys handed out gloves and hats, not chains. "You'll be fixing fences, moving hay, cleaning stalls. Work hard, and there's lunch at noon," one said. It was unthinkable. The first day was blistering. The Texas sun bore down like a furnace. The Germans sweated through their uniforms, blistered their palms, and muttered about American cruelty. But when the lunch bell rang, the cowboys didn't eat apart from them. They shared their food: cold sandwiches, boiled eggs, even a pitcher of iced tea. Schulte tried to make sense of it. "They trust us with tools," he whispered to another prisoner. "They eat beside us. Why?" The answer came from a cowboy named Hank, who spoke slowly, his words heavy with southern drawl. "You're working men, same as us. We don't feed slaves in Texas." By the third week, the P started whistling while they worked. They learned to ride in the back of trucks, to patch barbed wire, to mend saddles. They learned American jokes and slang. and the cowboys laughed when they tried to mimic it. Something strange began to happen. The fear started to fade. Schult noticed that when the guards smiled, the men smiled back. The once rigid soldiers now looked forward to work. They even began to hum along to the cowboys' radio, where country music blended with the sound of cattle and wind. Each night the Germans returned to camp covered in dust, but oddly content. The Americans, Shelter wrote in his diary, do not win by domination. They win by decency. For men raised to believe in superiority and obedience, Texas was teaching them something revolutionary. Equality wasn't weakness, it was strength. And soon, one barbecue would burn that truth into their hearts forever. By midsummer, the daily rhythm between cowboys and prisoners had settled into something that didn't look like war at all. The ranchers knew the Germans worked hard. The prisoners knew the Americans kept their word. Slowly, a cautious friendship began to form. Not through words, but through small, unspoken acts of respect. When one of the PS twisted his ankle, chasing a stray calf, the foreman drove him straight to a local doctor, not the camp medic. When another prisoner complained of blisters, a cowboy handed him a pair of worn leather gloves, saying only, "You'll need these more than me." There were still fences, still rifles at the gate, still the distant reminder that they were enemies. But something was changing in the air. The first sign came one Saturday afternoon when the foreman invited the PS to stay late after work. Smoke drifted across the pasture. Music crackled from a dusty radio. The smell of barbecue carried on the wind. The prisoners hesitated. "Is this for us?" one asked, almost afraid to believe it. "Sure is," said the foreman. "You worked like hell this week. It's time to eat like men." The cowboys grilled thick slabs of beef over mesquite coals, flipping them with tongs as sparks rose into the fading light. They passed around cornbread and beans, letting the Germans serve themselves. Some of the prisoners stared at the plates, uncertain. Others laughed nervously. One of the younger cowboys clapped a German soldier on the shoulder. "Don't look so serious, Fritz. You're in Texas now." That broke the tension. Soon the campyard was filled with laughter. Broken English mixed with broken German. The clinking of bottles. The sound of men who were supposed to be enemies sharing a meal. Captain Shoulder stood apart at first, watching. He was a man built from iron habits, trained never to fraternize with the enemy. But as the laughter grew louder, something inside him softened. He joined a group near the grill. One cowboy poured him a Coca-Cola straight from a cooler of ice. "You ever had one of these?" Shelty shook his head. The fizz startled him, then made him smile. "This," said the cowboy, raising his own bottle, "is America's secret weapon." Everyone laughed, but Schulte didn't. He looked at the dark glass bottle, at the bubbles racing toward the light, and realized the man was right. What defeated Germany wasn't just bombs or tanks. It was this: a country so confident it could share food with its prisoners. When the sun went down, a few of the PS began singing a quiet German song, something soft and sad. The cowboys didn't stop them. They just kept tending the fire, listening. Schulte would later write in his journal, "They are not the monsters we were told they were. They are strong because they choose mercy over hate." That night, as the flames died down, one cowboy said it best: "We fight hard, we work harder, but when the day is done, we all eat." It was the kind of simple truth that could end a war faster than any weapon. The day of the feast began like any other. Dust in the air, the sound of boots on dry earth, cattle lowing in the distance. The sun rose hot and sharp over the Texas plains. For the PS, it was another workday on the ranch. None of them knew that by noon something would happen they would remember for the rest of their lives. When the truck pulled up, it wasn't loaded with tools or hay. It carried crates of beef, onions, and bottles of Coca-Cola packed in ice. The ranch hands began building a fire pit out of stones, talking and laughing as if preparing for a festival. "What's going on?" one German asked, his voice cautious. "Barbecue," said Hank. The same cowboy who taught them to mend fences. You boys worked hard. Time to eat like Texans. The prisoners looked at one another uncertain. In their minds, kindness from an enemy always came with a catch. As the fire crackled, and the scent of grilled meat drifted across the pasture, even the most skeptical of them felt their hunger overpower suspicion. They lined up quietly. Each man handed a paper plate with a thick hamburger on a toasted bun, a slice of onion, and a bottle of Coca-Cola so cold the glass fogged in the heat. Captain Erwin Schulte stood near the end of the line, still stiff in his posture, his pride holding him upright even after defeat. When his turn came, Hank handed him a plate and smiled. "Don't worry, Captain, we didn't poison it." The joke broke the tension. Schulte actually laughed, a real unguarded laugh that startled even him. He sat down at the long wooden table around him. German soldiers who had once shouted Heil Hitler now murmured simple thanks as they bit into hamburgers for the first time. The sound of chewing, the fizz of soda bottles opening, the murmured laughter. It was a sound no one expected to hear between enemies. Schule took his first bite. The taste of hot beef and salt hit him like a memory of home, but mixed with something new, something he couldn't name. He took a sip of the Coca-Cola. The sweetness and bubbles burned his throat. He coughed, laughed again, and then something inside him broke. He put down the bottle, covered his face, and wept silently. The ranch fell quiet. No one mocked him. No one spoke. Even the cowboys seemed to understand. In that moment, it wasn't about food or drink. It was about disbelief that an enemy could feed you better than your own army ever did. That a nation you were taught to hate could show you kindness without asking anything in return. Hank, seeing Schulte's shaking hands, quietly refilled his cup with more soda and said, "You're all right, Captain. We ain't your enemies anymore." Schulte didn't reply. He just nodded, the tears falling freely now, his pride dissolving like ice in the sun. Later, as the men cleaned up, a young turned to Schulte and asked, "Why do they do this? Why treat us like friends?" Schulte looked at the cowboys, their laughter echoing across the field, and said softly, "Because they can. That's why we lost." That night, as he wrote in his journal, he captured it in a single line. "They saved us, and in doing so, they starved the hate that had kept us blind." The hamburger and the Coca-Cola had done what years of war could not. They had taught him humility. That night, back inside the camp, the men could barely speak. The taste of the food lingered on their tongues, but their flavor was something else. Humiliation turned to awe. What they had experienced on that ranch was not just hospitality. It was a form of quiet, devastating victory. Captain Erwin Schulte lay awake on his bunk, his thoughts spinning. All his life he had been told that Americans were soft, crude, incapable of true discipline. Yet, the men he met today, those tanned cowboys with steady hands and easy laughter, were everything Germany's propaganda said they weren't. He thought of the words the cowboy had said before the meal. "We ain't your enemies anymore." It sounded absurd, yet somehow it had felt true. He remembered Berlin's factories, the endless propaganda reels showing heroic workers forging weapons for the fatherland, while real families starved in the ruins. He thought of his own men freezing on the Eastern Front, gnawing on horse meat while officers hoarded supplies. And then he remembered the Texans feeding their prisoners hamburgers, handing them Coca-Cola as if it were communion. The moral arithmetic didn't make sense. The United States had spent over $1.8 billion building and maintaining its P camps, nearly the same cost as manufacturing 20,000 Sherman tanks. To a German officer's mind, that was madness. Feeding the enemy when your own sons were dying overseas. Unthinkable. Yet the Americans did it without hesitation. That was the real math of victory. Not the number of bullets fired or tanks produced, but the weight of conscience carried by a nation that refused to become the monster it fought. In the dark barracks, Schule opened his small journal and began to write by the faint light of a match. They defeated us without hatred, he wrote, without cruelty. They built a system strong enough to spare kindness. Outside, the night was still. Somewhere a guard hummed softly, a cowboy tune. The sound carried through the wire, gentle and haunting. For the first time since the war began, Schulte felt peace. Not surrender, but peace. The kind that comes when illusion collapses. In Germany, he had seen civilians whipped for stealing bread. Here he saw captives offering bread freely to their enemies. That contrast hit harder than any bombing raid. The Reich had built its power on fear and obedience. America, he realized, built its power on trust. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet seep in. Tomorrow they would return to work as usual, fixing fences, hauling hay, but nothing would be the same. The war had already ended inside him. He whispered into the darkness. They conquered us with hamburgers. It sounded ridiculous, yet it was the most honest thing he'd ever said. For all the tanks and planes, all the guns and slogans, the truth was brutally simple. Ideology had collapsed in the face of decency. As Schulte drifted into sleep, one final line formed in his mind. A truth he could never admit to his comrades, but would one day tell his children. They defeated us without a single insult, just food. A week after the barbecue, the prisoners were given their monthly privilege to write letters home. Most filled the usual space with reassurance. I am healthy. I am working. I hope you are safe. But for Captain Erwin Schulte, something in him refused to write the same hollow words. He sat at the long wooden table inside the recreation hut, pen trembling in his hand, the air thick with the scent of dust and sweat. Then he began his letter, not to his wife, but to his brother Karl, who still served in what was left of the Luftwaffe. Brother, he wrote, you will not believe this, but the Americans, our enemies, fed us as if we were their neighbors. He described the cowboys, the laughter, the Coca-Cola, the simple generosity that had struck him harder than any shell. He told Karl that these men did not act like conquerors. They worked beside their captives, trusted them with tools, and even shared jokes that made the long hours bearable. Across the room, another prisoner, young Hans Richter, was writing something similar. His letter began, Dear Mother, the Americans are nothing like we were told. They don't hate us. They feed us like brothers. Dozens of letters like these crossed the Atlantic weeks later, slipping through censors who didn't recognize the quiet power in their words. When they reached German homes, they landed like whispers of forbidden truth. Mothers wept as they read about kindness from the enemy. Fathers shook their heads in disbelief. Some refused to believe it entirely, calling it Allied propaganda, but others deep down knew it was real. In villages where food was scarce and bombs fell nightly, those letters carried something rarer than bread: hope. One widow from Hamburg later recalled reading a neighbor's letter aloud. He said the Americans let them work in the sun, that they were given meat and coffee. We could not understand. It sounded like a fairy tale. But the fairy tale spread. Within months, German civilians began to question the regime's lies. If the enemy treated their prisoners better than the Reich treated its soldiers, then who truly represented civilization? Captain Schulte never knew the ripple effect of his words. He didn't see the small acts of rebellion his letter inspired. Farmers refusing to inform on neighbors, factory workers slowing production for the collapsing Nazi war machine. But the story did. When war ended, Allied intelligence officers would later discover that P letters from America had a measurable psychological impact. They undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than 1,000 bombers could. Inside the camp, as Schulte sealed his envelope, he felt a strange calm. He didn't know whether his letter would survive the journey, but he knew it carried something far more dangerous than any bullet. The truth. He looked out across the Texas plains, where the cowboys were riding home for the day, and murmured, If my brother reads this, he'll know what really won the war. And in a sense, he was right. Not steel, not gunpowder, not fire, but the quiet victory of decency. A story written not on battlefields, but on paper, in ink, across an ocean of disbelief. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the camp gates clanged open again. The same dust-coated truck from the ranch rolled in, its engine rumbling low, carrying a familiar figure in a wide-brimmed hat. The prisoners recognized him instantly, the cowboy who grilled them hamburgers and served them Coca-Cola. Hank climbed out of the cab, a small crate in his arms. He walked straight toward the prisoners, smiling the same unshakable smile that had once disarmed their fear. "Morning, boys," he said. "Bro for you." Inside the crate were jars, homemade preserves, their lids sealed tight, labeled in careful handwriting. Peach Jam, Texas, summer 1945. The Germans stared, stunned into silence. After weeks of tension and reflection, the sight of this man returning with gifts, not orders, not demands, broke the walls that even kindness hadn't yet breached. Captain Schulte stepped forward. "Why?" he asked in halting English. "Why bring this for us?" Hank shrugged. "Because war is almost done. You fellas worked hard. My mom made too much jam anyway." The absurd simplicity of it nearly made Schulte laugh. This cowboy, who had every reason to hate them, had returned with sweetness. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and accepted one of the jars. For a moment, both men just stood there, the officer and the rancher, the enemy and the host, their eyes meeting across a gulf wider than the Atlantic. Then Hank extended his hand. Schulte hesitated, then took it. The handshake was firm, real, not a gesture of surrender or authority, but mutual respect. Around them, the other PS watched, their expressions unreadable. For many, it was the first time they'd seen a German officer willingly shake an American's hand. Hank chuckled softly. "Guess we're all just folks now, huh?" Shelley didn't answer, but his silence said enough. In that grip, he felt something break loose inside him. Not weakness, but relief. The realization that humanity had survived where ideology had failed. Later that evening, when the guards weren't watching closely, the PS gathered in the barracks. Schulte opened the jar with the handle of a spoon. The sweet smell of peaches filled the room. He dipped a finger into the jam, tasted it, and smiled faintly. "Real sugar," he whispered. "Not rationed, not fake." They passed the jar around like a relic, each man taking a taste, each remembering a different life, a different home. For those few minutes, they weren't prisoners. They were men, free if only in spirit. Outside, the cowboy's truck rumbled back toward the horizon, a plume of dust trailing behind it. As darkness fell, Shula wrote in his journal, "The cowboy returned today. He brought no sermons, no victory speeches, only sweetness. I have fought for an empire that preached strength and gave hunger. Today, an enemy fed me jam and left me in silence. And I think I finally understand what freedom tastes like." He closed the notebook and lay back on his bunk, the jar sitting on the table beside him, catching the last rays of the Texas sunset. Tomorrow, the world would continue turning toward peace. But for tonight, the war had already ended, sealed in glass under a label that read, "Texas, Summer 1945. Weeks later, the war was officially over. The camp loudspeaker blared with static before a voice announced the inevitable. Germany had surrendered. Some men cheered, others wept silently. But for Captain Schulte, the moment felt strangely calm, as if he had already surrendered long before Berlin ever did. The PS were ordered to gather their belongings and prepare for transfer to repatriation centers. The air buzzed with rumors that they'd soon go home, that America would punish them, that freedom might be just another lie. But as the final days unfolded, none of that happened. Instead, the cowboys came again, not with rifles this time, but with food. The ranchers brought leftover steaks, loaves of bread, and bottles of root beer. There were no speeches, no flags, no celebrations, just one last meal under the open Texas sky. Hank, the same cowboy who'd once handed them hamburgers and peach jam, raised his cup to peace. He said, "You boys take this world and make it better than we did." The Germans didn't know how to respond. They simply nodded, clinking their tin cups together. The sound was soft, almost reverent, like a prayer whispered into the wind. Schulter ate slowly, watching the smoke from the fire twist into the night. The same hands that had once built weapons now reached for food offered by their enemies. The same men who had once sworn oaths to an empire now sat shoulder to shoulder with Texans who had every reason to despise them. And yet there was no hate, not even resentment, just something else, understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. Schulte took out his small journal one last time and wrote, "They called them cowboys. We called them fools, but it turns out the fools were us." He paused, tapping the pen against the page. Then he added, "We built fear. They built trust. We chained men. They fed them. And somehow, that's how they won." After dinner, he walked toward Hank, who was dousing the fire. "You have taught me more about strength," Shelter said, his voice quiet. "Than all my officers ever did." Hank smiled. "We just try to treat folks right, that's all." The German officer nodded. "Maybe that's the greatest power there is." That night, as the PS lay in their bunks for the final time, they could hear laughter drifting in from the guards' campfire. It wasn't mocking or cruel. It was simple, human, alive. And in that laughter, Schultz realized something profound. The men who had captured them had become their teachers, not through dominance, but through decency. Years later, when he would tell his grandchildren about his time in America, he would say, "We lost the war in Europe, but in Texas, we found something better: how to be human again." The war had concluded with treaties and signatures, but the true triumph had occurred long before, beneath the shade of a ranch house, with smoke curling from a grill and the taste of Coca-Cola lingering on the tongue. Because compassion, once revealed, can never be unseen, and no captive remains imprisoned when mercy becomes the lesson. The camp gates swung open one final time. Trucks waited along the dirt road, prepared to carry the POWs to the rail station for their long voyage home. The Germans gathered their few possessions, a handful of letters, a Bible, a tin cup, and for Captain Schulte, one small jar of peach preserves he had kept hidden since that day. He turned once more to gaze at the ranch, the dusty fields glowing amber beneath the Texas sun. The cowboys stood by the fence, hats in hand, not as conquerors but as equals. Schulte lifted his arm in a quiet salute. "You showed us what victory truly means," he said softly. Then he stepped into the truck, leaving behind not a prison, but a memory. As the convoy rumbled away, the breeze carried with it the scent of mesquite and barbecue smoke. A place that had once held enemies had become something sacred, a testament that decency could outlast war. They had once mocked the cowboy, but in the end, it was the cowboy who showed them what it meant to be human. History remembers wars by those who prevail, but sometimes the purest victory belongs to the ones who chose kindness when cruelty came easier. And somewhere far across the Atlantic, a few German families unfolded letters sent from Texas.